Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the next installment of the CrySP speaker series on privacy. It's our great pleasure to have Professor Nicholas Hopper. Nicholas Hopper got his PhD from CMU and is now an associate professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Minnesota. And he just finished a sabbatical, spending a year as the visiting research director of the Tor project. So, so it's our pleasure to have him here today. Let's welcome Nick.
All right, thanks. So I'm going to be talking today about some work that I've been doing with my students, John, Shuai, and Max at the University of Minnesota, and a little bit of work that Chris Thompson did when he was an undergrad at Minnesota, on looking at new ways for adversaries or censors to mess with censorship circumvention schemes. So all of this is in the context of internet censorship. So what do I mean by internet censorship? So we imagine we've got some client who lives in a repressive or authoritarian regime, and that client's government or ISP has some views about what that client should be doing on the internet. So there are some sites on the internet that it's okay for the client to go see, okay? And so if the client, say, tries to go to see Monorail Cat, that'll be allowed. But there are other sites on the internet that that client's ISP or government sees as too subversive and won't allow the client to see. So if the client tries to access those sites directly, the government sets up its internet infrastructure so that it can block requests to that website, typically by IP address, although I guess sometimes it's also by content filtering. Okay? And then so in response to this kind of practice, there are several deployed censorship circumvention schemes. One of them is, of course, Tor. So in Tor, you've got these onion routers, relays that are not hosting these subversive content directly. And the client can connect to them and build some kind of circuit. And so to the ISP, the client's ISP or the censor, it looks like the client is accessing a Tor node, not necessarily accessing this forbidden content. Okay, but more and more we're seeing in response to the existence of systems like Tor, governments and or ISPs are enumerating the list of Tor nodes and just blocking them by IP address. So you can't access Tor because you might use Tor to access things that we don't want you to see. Okay? So that's the basic idea of censorship and censorship circumvention. And this brings up like two properties that a circumvention scheme needs to have to sort of work against the censor who is willing to block the circumvention schemes. Okay, so the first is unblockability, right? So it should be hard just by looking at, for example, the destination address to block connections that are going to a circumvention system. And usually this means also without blocking all of the internet or a lot of traffic which the government does not object to, because otherwise they can always just turn off the internet. Yes?
If you're going to answer this as you go along, don't answer it now. Just go ahead and say that you're going to do so. But it would seem that it should be hard to block connection to the original system. So, but in saying this, you seem to be accepting that they're going to block connection to the original system. So why is there a difference that it's okay to block access to the original system, but we're going to prevent blockage of the circumvention system? Do you understand
Right, so the question is, why are we trying to prevent blocking access to the circumvention system rather than trying to block access to the original system?
Prevent blockage of access
Right,
to the original system.
right. To prevent blocking access to the original system.
Problem?
Well, so the reason that there's a difference is the civil disobedience cat site doesn't necessarily know that there are people in Syria who want to access civil disobedience cat's website, right? So they can't. They don't necessarily build their site to be unblockable, right? So if we build one system which is unblockable and can be used to access every site, then we don't have to replicate that solution for every site that wants to be unblockable.
Okay, so then why not just make the original system unblockable?
Right. So the answer is the question is why not just make the original system unblockable? Right. So that's what we're looking at is why is it hard to make a system unblockable?
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. To go on.
Okay. Okay. So so that brings up the first aspect, which is it should be hard to block connections to the circumvention system without also blocking a large class of traffic which the censor is not willing to block. All right, so for example, one way that Tor has tried to partially solve this problem is by having these unlisted relays, things that are not, you can't just go and read a list of all of them, called bridges. And then clients whose governments or ISPs are blocking access to the Tor relays won't necessarily know about the addresses of the bridges. And so they won't a priori just be able to block connections to those IP addresses. Okay, but we've already seen several governments respond to this by finding ways to figure out whether someone is using Tor, whether or not they're accessing a known relay. So, for example, the Chinese Great Firewall was for a long time fingerprinting the SSL connection that Tor users made to bridges. It didn't look quite like a regular SSL connection. And so they could notice that this connection was different and then try to connect to the bridge and figure out that it was an IP address, it was a bridge, and block its IP address. Okay? We would like to have this not be the case, so this means that there's a second property that we need in order to get, there's an extra E in there. Anyways, in order to get unblockability, we also require that the censorship circumvention scheme has unobservability, which means that it's hard to tell that someone is connecting to a censorship circumvention scheme and not just participating in some larger class of allowable traffic. Okay. And so this sort of has led in the sort of Tor infrastructure to kind of an arms race where Tor has some various ways of trying to keep censors from finding out the IP addresses of all their bridges. They have systems like something called Social Bridge, something called Flash Proxy, something called Meek. And Tor has a bunch of different ways of encrypting their traffic so that it doesn't look like anything in particular. So there's something called obfs proxy, something called scramble suit, something called format transforming encryption. And so right now they're kind of playing in this arms race, okay? And so that's kind of on the practical side. And on the theoretical side, researchers have been proposing systems in which they try to make traffic look more and more like widely allowed classes of traffic. Okay, and so we're going to look at some of these research side solutions, and they're going to allow us to think about new things that censors might try to do if these kinds of schemes, not the ones that are here, but these research schemes, start being deployed as well. Okay. So we'll look at a few different classes of schemes. The first class is something called decoy routing, which is an idea that I imagine most people here are familiar with, since one of the three papers that proposed it at the same time was from the CrySP lab. It's called something called telex. But all right, so if you weren't here or haven't heard of it, here's how decoy routing works. So you've got your client, and they're connected to some autonomous system or ISP, which is going to try to filter their traffic. And that ISP is connected to other ISPs. So each of these little router symbols is representing an autonomous system or an ISP, which is what the internet is composed of, right? These autonomous systems. And also, of course, various websites are connected to different ISPs. So we've got like our allowable websites like Monorail Cat and our disallowable websites like Civil Disobedience Cat. And did something just happen there? Oh, okay. So right, this is the one that's not allowed. Our client would like to visit Civil Disobedience Cat, but it knows that if it just sends a packet to Civil Disobedience Cat, its ISP will filter that packet. The client knows that it could send something to Monorail Cat, but of course it wouldn't get content back from Civil Disobedience Cat. But the idea behind decoy routing is, I'm one slide ahead here, that's why. Right. The idea behind decoy routing is, well, what if one of the routers out on the internet was willing to help us? Okay? If there was a router that was sitting in between the client and Monorail Cat, maybe we could send traffic that looked like it was supposed to go to Monorail Cat, but which had hidden inside it some information which told any router, any decoy router along the path, that actually I'm trying to talk to Civil Disobedience Cat. Okay, and if it happened to hit this router, the router would look at this hidden information and say, this client actually wants to access the Civil Disobedience Cat site. I will contact that site, download the information, and send it back to the client in the name of the Monorail Cat site. Okay. All right, so that's the idea of decoy routing. So if we get some ISPs to help us out with this, we can send traffic that looks like it's going to innocent sites, but which in fact causes subversive sites to be accessed. All right, and so in decoy routing, the terminology that we'll use is the Monorail Cat is the overt destination, the place that the client is pretending to want to talk to, and Civil Disobedience Cat is the covert destination, the place that the client actually wants to talk to. Okay? So now it turns out to be a little tricky to get this to work right because our ISP actually gets to decide where the packets are sent that the client sends to him. All right, and so there are some problems with deploying this which are solvable in principle, but which can be kind of stumbling blocks on observability. So, for example, one thing we talked about that needs to be solved by would need to be solved by a deployment of these is something called which we call the Crazy Ivan attack. I guess this goes back to the discussion that there are people who are younger than this building in this room, and the movie that this references is older than this building. That's why I'm getting the blank stares. All right, so the way the Crazy Ivan, I won't explain the reference, we'll just explain the attack. The way the Crazy Ivan attack works is, so the client's ISP in this, is animation going to happen? Yes. Okay, so the client's ISP in this topology, which of course is completely representative of the internet in every way, has two choices to how to send packets which are addressed to the over destination monorail cat. Right? It could send them along this path, in which case they will reach the decoy router and be sent to civil disobedience cat, or it can send them along this path, in which case they'll never be seen by this decoy router, which is down here. Okay, and so in the Crazy Ivan attack, the ISP is just looking for flows which behave strangely. And of course, the internet is built supposedly following the end-to-end principle, which says that a host shouldn't care how packets got to it, right? So in principle, the router should be able to, usually the censor ISP should be able to normally send things along this path, and then every so often just send a few packets along this path, okay? There's nothing in the internet that says you can't, in the internet protocol that says you can't do that, and normal TCP implementations should be okay with this. Okay. But if the client is communicating using decoy routing, of course, the packets that it's been sending nominally to the overt destination along this decoy routing path have not actually been getting, most of them, to the overt destination. And so when a packet is sent along this other path and shows up at the overt destination is going to be confused by this packet, which is part of a connection that it no longer or never saw, depending on which implementation of decoy routing you're using. And it will probably send some sort of reset packet back or behave in some other unexpected way because it's not seeing all of these packets. And so the behavior of the monorail cat, of the overt destination, in response to this routing switch will tell the ISP something about whether this TCP connection is using decoy routing or not. Okay, so of course this is not an insurmountable problem if you have enough decoy routers or I think there are probably ways to solve it, but it's one kind of issue with one sort of unobservability issue that comes up. Another kind of unobservability issue that comes up is in another totally representative internet topology. The distance from the decoy router in terms of wire or ISP hops or something to the overt destination and the decoy router to the covert destination might be different. And so the timing, the latency of packet of packets and acknowledgments, sequence numbers and acknowledgments on connections which are being decoy routed will look different from the latency on packets which are going to which are actually going to the overt destination. And so, an example of this, we picked on telex because they're the only people who actually implemented it. So this is a histogram or a density function of latency on packets sent through the overt or sent through the telex router to Gmail versus, that's here. And this is the latency sent to the actual overt destination that you can access behind the telex router, which is, there's one of them. But two of them, that's right. Blocked and not blocked. Okay, and so you can see that these latency distributions are different, and so this would allow a...
From one location, is it from one location, this answer? Is this graph derived from one location? Because if the test is routed just like a little bit off the side.
I'm sorry? So
is this graph drawn from one location? Like, did you ask the Gmail from one location or like multiple locations? And the result was
so we asked, so we loaded Gmail through telex from a host on the University of Minnesota campus. And we loaded the overt destination that we used when loading Gmail through telex from the same host, right? And we saw two different latency distributions, even though they should have been going, they should have been going to the same host.
Right. So it was just that there are maybe at least some people who wouldn't see such a gap because they're closer to the telex router person.
Or the same distance from both.
From your closest one and telex, which is still close to telex router. What I'm saying is maybe some people don't have this issue.
Everyone would have this issue, right? This is caused by the difference in the delay from going from the telex server to Gmail or Google and the telex server to not blocked, right? But it is certainly the case that there could be different, so everyone would see this difference, but there could be different covert destinations. Right.
What is density?
I'm sorry?
What is density?
Probability density. So each of these, so this is how many times, what fraction of the packets in our connection saw a latency of 40 milliseconds, 41, 42.
So this is just like telex doing its thing. Because it might be that the path to Gmail goes through that router anyway. Like it goes through the telex router anyway. And
so this is caused by the fact that there's a different path length from the telex router to the overt destination and the telex router to the covert destination. Right? So there could be it is conceivable that there could be pairs of overt and covert destinations which had similar traffic latency distributions after the telex router or decoy router in general, right? But that would require some searching, right, to find overt covert destination pairs that would work to prevent this, right, Suki?
So this is from one host, right? Won't you probably get the same distribution if you accessed Gmail from two different ISPs, probably in the same country, but then those ISPs will have their own BGP route to Gmail, so you'll have variable latency, not probably as much as telex, but still you would have a variable latency even if you're pinging from, say, like 2 different hosts. And then, I mean, am I being clear? So even if you ping from 2 different hosts, you will have probably something like this because you won't have the same latency, right? And then in that case, how is this different from, say, me ping, like, if I ping Google from here and someone does it from, say, like, I don't know, British Columbia or somewhere, right?
So the ISP knows where you're coming from, right? So the ISP can measure the sensor can measure latency from when it passes its border to the destination, right? Okay. All right. So again, I think that this is, in principle, something that could be solved, but it's a complication. So, these are kind of traditional adversary, or close to a traditional adversary model of unobservability. There's nothing. I guess we're taking into account that the adversary is an ISP and can see things going on, but we haven't given the adversary new powers. All right, so a more interesting problem for decoy routing is that the adversary, the censor, who's working against or trying to circumvent a decoy routing system, so circumvent the circumventors, has the ability to choose the routes that it uses over the internet. And now you can't choose routes arbitrarily with the internet routing protocol. You can only choose among routes that are advertised to you. But this means that, for example, when an adversary, a censoring ISP has multiple choices of how to reach a given block of IP addresses on the internet, if the adversary knows that there is a decoy router along one of those paths, the adversary could choose to use the other path. Right? And if for every destination, or for most destinations, the adversary can choose a path that does not have a decoy router along it, then that makes the decoy routing system ineffective against that censor. Right? And so this is kind of a new way of looking at what censors can do to circumvent these systems by actually changing how they route packets on the internet. So the routing adversary is kind of a new power that we could ascribe to censors. And so it means that if we wanted to deploy an effective decoy routing scheme, we need to think carefully about where we're locating those decoy routers, which ISPs we're asking to participate for us. So, for example, if we can make sure that, one possibility would be try to make sure that many routes to popular destinations have decoy routers along them. Okay, so but maybe that doesn't work in practice because there's not always enough choices or something. So let me just convince you that that actually is pretty realistic for a lot of possible nation-state level censors, at least. Okay, so first, remember our attack was prefaced on the assumption that we could figure out where decoy routers are, or if a path had a decoy router along it, right? Now in telex, that's not a problem because I guess the telex paper had this claim that we're just going to hand out lists of where these things are. But I think some of the decoy routing systems want the clients not to have to know where they are. I think Syrupede is like that. For instance, there's this spamming the internet phase where you try to find a router without knowing exactly where it is. But so the idea is we have an ISP, and they want to find which ISPs out there are deploying decoy routers. And so what we're going to do is we're going to basically run an intersection attack. All right, so the ISP has a copy of the decoy routing client software, because we want people to be able to get the decoy routing client software. And so what we do is we choose overt destinations attached to each ISP on the internet. And then we look at all the paths that we have on the internet. And we initially mark all ISPs on the internet as potentially being decoy routing deployers or decoy routers. Okay? And we go through our lists of paths to destinations, and we send a packet to an overt destination in each of those on each of those paths using the decoy routing client. Okay, and on each path where we fail to reach our covert destination, we know that all the ISPs on that path are not decoy routers. Right? Okay, and so we repeat this process for every path that we know. And when we're done, anything that we haven't marked as not a decoy router is a decoy router, or probably a decoy router. Right? It's either a decoy router or it's behind a decoy router, so we couldn't tell. And in fact, we using the CADA inferred internet topology, simulated this attack for a variety of nation-state adversaries, assuming anything from a very small number of ISPs acting as decoy routers to a substantial fraction of all ISPs acting as decoy routers, and showed that you can generally identify, even if we have 1,000 decoy routers, something like 97% of the decoy routers.
What the other chips and not get it?
I'm sorry?
What did the other chips and not get it?
Those are decoy routers which were always behind another decoy router in the topology. So there's no way to know. Okay.
1,000 decoy routers compared to how many S's? Like, what's the?
So there are, I believe, 40,000 ASs roughly. There are 40,000 ASs, but these are the 1,000 largest ASs.
Okay.
There are 40,000 ASs, but I think there are 5,000 that are not stubs, that have client ASs.
So did
Okay.
you try to optimize for specific countries that are attached to these?
No, we just chose a bunch of example countries, right? So China, Australia, Iran, Syria, France. No, I don't. VE. I'm sorry? Venezuela, I think, yeah. Well, I think it is Venezuela that we used. But, yeah.
So you still have a large fraction of untainted paths to compare against.
Right. Oh, and if I had gone to the next slide, I would actually. All right. Okay. Right. So actually, I mean, one of the main differences, you can see that the shape of all these curves is very similar. One of the main differences between these different plots is just the number of ASs that are inside of the countries, which we excluded for different countries. So, All right. All right, so yeah, this gives you a idea of the scale of some of the different ASs that we looked at. Okay. So we can find the deploying decoy routers.
What's POC?
POC. That's a good question.
Is the egress and egress points?
No, because it's
So while they might be in ASNs, they might concentrate around a certain point before going out of the country. Like the firewall points.
I'm sorry, I don't remember what that column of that table means. Okay, so we wanted to look at, so given that we showed that we could find where the ASs were if we were a routing adversary and could choose which, where the decoy routers were if we were a routing adversary and could choose which paths to send our packets along. We wanted to look at different deployment options and see how effective they would be against this routing adversary. Okay, so we looked in the literature at different proposed deployments. So one proposed deployment was just to randomly choose among the non-stub ASs on the internet some fraction of them and say, you get to be a decoy router. Okay? And we looked at whether that would be very effective against a routing adversary. Okay, so you can see that if you chose like 2% of all the 5,000 or so non-stub ASs on the internet and said, why don't you be a decoy router for us? What you would wind up with is that at most, say, 3% of the internet would be sort of unreachable to a routing adversary who just said, okay, I'm not going to route packets if I have to send them through a decoy router, and otherwise I'm going to choose a different path. Okay, and even if you got as much as 10% of the non-stub ISPs to act as decoy routers, you'd still be only cutting off something like less than 10% of the rest of the internet.
So how are you measuring the percent of the internet you can get to, like number of IP addresses you can access?
I think this, yeah, so this graph is in terms of just ASs.
So how many ASs?
Yeah, how many ISPs get cut off. The shape is very similar and the numbers are very similar if you weight by
Alexa top
IPs.
100 you could access or something, the graph might look very different. Depending which row, I mean with the random ones maybe it wouldn't, but if you strategically place them, you might be able to have very few and still say can't get to many of the popular websites.
You can go to the US Embassy to apply for visa.
Is the US Embassy in the Alexa top 100?
Well, it's an important one for, say, China, say.
I don't know if we have the graph by Alexa top 100, but I know that if you replace ASs with ISPs, the numbers look similar. Or not with ISPs, IPs. All right. Another idea, which appeared in the Cirripede paper, which was, okay, so actually it's kind of expensive to get a box like this onto an ISP, so maybe we'd like to not have to deploy to 2% of all the non-stub ISPs. So they looked at, well, what if we just got the top K ASs to act as decoy routers for us, like the top 10, right? And they, in the Cirripede paper, they showed that actually that was fairly effective if you used the routes that the non-adaptively chosen routes. that say China or whoever had chosen, you would be able to reach, almost everyone would be able to reach a decoy router with a very small, with high probability. But if the, and this is, of course, it is more effective to choose from the large ISPs than randomly. So you can see that, for example, if you got the 40 largest ISPs, now an adversary is looking at having to cut off something like 10% of the internet in the case of China, or 20% in the case of most of the rest, to avoid ever sending things over a decoy router. Which maybe, maybe the censors aren't willing to cut off 20% of the internet.
Sorry. So do you have a graph that's a fraction of, you do decide fraction, and then the x-axis is your minimum number of, like if you chose them strategically, your minimum number of ASs you need to get on board, which may be very surprisingly small. That could be like,
I thought in your paper you do the one where you're very close to the censor, like you just basically try to surround them. But the argument is it'd be too expensive.
Yes, I'm getting there, but I think that's a different question. So Tao's question, I think, is so if I have on the x-axis desired fraction of unreachable IP addresses, and the y-axis is minimum number of decoy routers necessary to reach this fraction.
right.
That's a hard optimization problem that we didn't try to solve.
Is it? I mean,
It is.
it sounds like okay.
It's NP hard.
It isn't.
Yes. So,
do you have any feel for what the impact to, say, China would be if they just decided we're not routing through the 10 largest ASs? How would that affect everybody's internet? Like, would that actually be a workable solution for them to just avoid all the biggest ASs and all their paths as far as like latency and throughput of running through the little guys for everything always?
okay, so so if China decided not to route through the 10%, the 10 largest ASs, right? 10 is right here. We're looking at.
So I'm not saying 100% of the internet would be unreachable, but for the percent that is reachable, how much would the performance be degraded by avoiding all of the really big ASs all the time?
Right. So what would be the cost in terms of latency and throughput?
Yeah.
Question. The answer is I don't know. So let's see. Yes, the answer is I don't know. But I can say that well, I don't have graphs here in this slide deck to talk about it, but for example, you can, we have another paper where we talk about changing at which point you prioritize not talking to a decoy router in your decision about where to route. And even if you put that decision very last in your list of which path to choose, so you put it after business relationships and after path lengths, so that you're only choosing among equal AS path lengths, you still only wind up cutting off a very similar fraction of the internet. So,
I'm not wondering so much about reachability. It's just with the
right. But so I guess what I'm saying is that the fraction of so the fraction of, and this is weighted by IPs. So the fraction of traffic that you wind up sending over paths that have some, so you would wind up having to send over paths that were suboptimal, would be small still, right?
Sorry, is that true? Because just because this curve is going this way, it would seem to imply that by the time you have 20 ASs, a lot of paths are already suboptimal because the curve is going this way. Because otherwise, if you didn't have that effect, it would go this way.
Well, the internet is densely connected.
Yeah, but this curve is going this way, which would imply that by the time you have 2040, you're having a lot of suboptimal paths. Because otherwise, it wouldn't go this way; it would go the other way. Do you see? If there wasn't this effect, because of the distribution of the largest AS sizes, it would go the other way.
What?
So yeah, so this one is to the right of x equals y, or y equals x, and this and if there wasn't such an effect, it would go to the left of y equals x because the largest ASs are larger than the smaller ASs. Like he assumed that the internet was just a fan, it would go y left to the left of y. This is not.
You should go up and draw it on the board.
Yeah, but we don't have a lot of time to answer. Maybe.
I mean, it's certainly true that I mean, the further you get over here, the higher fraction of traffic you're going to wind up sending over suboptimal paths, right? That is certainly true. Okay, and now to switch to a flipped graph. There was one other suggested deployment in the literature, which came a couple of years later, which looked at, they called it the sorted deployment, where you look at, so this is the deployment where I'm targeting, say, making it hard for China to route around decoy routers. And so what I do is I look at all the paths coming out of China, and I pick the decoy router I pick the ISP that shows up on the highest number of paths as my first decoy router, and then I pick the ISP that shows up on the second highest number of paths as my second decoy router, and so on. So I order them in that way, and if I'm going to deploy to K, I deploy to the top K on that list. Okay, and that turns out to be quite a bit more effective, although now we're talking about targeting a particular sensor, right? So while this means that if I deploy to the top 10 sorted by their damage to China, I can make China sort of double the number of ISPs it can't talk to because I flip my graph. Okay, so that motivated us to. That got us thinking about if you're targeting a sensor, what could the sensor do to sort of target those deployers, those ISPs that had decoy routers in them, and so got us thinking about, in sort of different terms about trying to route around these decoy routers. Okay, so if you do exactly what Ryan suggested, so whenever you can route around a decoy router, you do, and otherwise you just bite the bullet and send the traffic through the decoy router. What impact are you having? Well, you are economically harming that decoy routing ISP a little bit because they're sending less traffic through them, and ISPs get paid based on how much traffic they carry. Okay, so there's a hit in the wallet when you send traffic that doesn't go to one of these ISPs. And so then we started thinking about ways to measure how much damage an ISP might take if it was deploying a decoy router targeted at, say, China or Brazil or some random European ISP. Okay. All right. So, there are a couple of things. Yeah. that we need to know about routing in order to discuss some of our attacks. So remember that on the internet, routing is done between ISPs, and the way routing works is, say this client network has some block of ISP addresses like 1.2.0/16. You guys all know what a /16 block of IP addresses is. Everyone is okay with that? All right, great. Saves me 30 seconds from explaining CIDR. Okay, so the ISP that this client is connected to will talk to its neighbors, other neighboring ISPs on the internet, and say, oh, I have a route to 1.2.0/16 and it goes through me, right? And then those neighbors, like this guy up here, will, if they choose that as their best route to 1.2.0/16, will send to their neighbors an announcement that says, I have a route to 1.2.0/16, and it goes through me and then through him, right? And those routes get propagated to the internet. Okay. And so what we wanted to look at is, okay, is there a way? So the censor chooses where outgoing traffic goes, so it can prevent its outgoing traffic from going to decoy routers. We wondered if there's a way for the censor to also prevent its incoming traffic from going through decoy routers. Okay, and so my student Max came up with this clever hack that depends on the way that IP routing works, or IP forwarding works. So the way we wanted to make as much of our traffic not come back to us through decoy routers as possible, it works like this. So this censor has a list of all the decoy routing ISPs, and when it wants to advertise a route to 1.2.0/16, it advertises that route just as before, but it also it splits 1.2.0/16 into two subnetworks, subblocks of IP addresses, so 1.2.0/17 and 1.2.28/17. Okay, and it sends out, in these two subblocks of advertisements, it appends to the path all of the decoy routing ISPs. Okay, and it sends out these announcements. And what happens is, that did not, okay. So what happens is these /17 addresses get sent to these two ISPs. But this ISP looks at this advertisement and says, oh, my neighbor is in this advertisement, this /17 advertisement. If I sent it to him, that would be a routing cycle, so I won't. Okay? And so the decoy router gets the /16 advertisement, so it can route things back to 1.2.0/16, but it doesn't get out of the /17 advertisements. Everyone who doesn't depend on having a path through the decoy router will get sent these /17 advertisements, and because IP forwarding is based on the most specific prefix, they will all send traffic that goes not through the decoy routers back to the censor. Okay?
Won't they send it through? So monorail cat will get the /17 that says, send me through yellow.
No, because so this advertisement will go up here, right? So I guess I reversed the order. Yellow should come after red. Right? Okay. So this will go up here, then blue will be next, then blue will be next. So it'll know that it follows this, and it's just going to imagine. It's going to think that there's yellow somewhere out there, but there's not.
So what will yellow see?
Yellow won't see it.
Only see the /16.
Yeah. Yep.
So monorail cat will see a /16 from yellow and a /17 from blue and send it.
Yep. Okay?
Okay.
All right. All right, so what does this do? So if we look at first, without this, this trick that Max came up with, how much traffic does a decoy router lose by China redirecting as much of its outgoing traffic as it can away from an ISP? We see that if China decides to care about path lengths, that's the red line, that say, for example, the median decoy router, I think this was in sorted 50 or sorted 100, sorted 50, I think. The sorted 50 deployment, the median decoy router will lose something like 0.25% of all the billable traffic it carries as a result of these routing decisions from China. And then if you do this trick of Max's, China, the median decoy router sees its losses increase by 75%. Okay, so the reverse makes things something like twice as painful or 75% more painful. Okay. Yep.
If the decoy router knows, for example, that China is a censoring regime that's likely to be doing something like this, can it take the paths that it has back to China and kind of partition them into a bunch and re-advertise more specific routes back to China to try to get around that attack? So basically partition it into several blocks that are more specific? Or would that just result in terrible things? I don't really know what BGP is.
I think you would get a lot of instability in the routing infrastructure if you started messing with advertisements. Potentially. Potentially you could do it. All right. So I've already gone over time and I didn't even get to talk about anything new. Okay, 5 more minutes. All right. So one other thing we wanted to study was what are the opportunity costs if decoy routers know that China, for example, or the censor in general, is implementing this policy. Okay, so they know that China will try to route as much of its traffic around decoy routers as possible. All right, so imagine that we've got 2 decoy routers now, and they both know that China is going to try to route traffic around them, right? And now we have a situation where we've got kind of like a prisoner's dilemma, right? Either these guys know that if they leave, if they turn off their decoy router, suddenly they can be guaranteed that they'll get all the traffic that goes between Monorail Cat and China. Does that make sense? All right, so they're facing an opportunity cost in traffic. And the more decoy routers there are, in general, sort of the more tempting it's going to look to turn off your decoy router because there's more traffic that you can potentially attract from China or whoever the target is in a targeted deployment, right? Let's see. Right. So we looked at, so the last slide that I showed you was percentage of billable traffic. But we wanted to put these things in cold, hard cash terms. So we, Max took a hit and read like 100 financial reports from ISPs. He's a good student. And it turns out that most of them don't really want to tell you how much money they get from carrying traffic. But about 15 of them gave us numbers that were how much revenue they got from carrying traffic. And so what we were able to do was figure out, using a model developed by others, about how much traffic goes to different places on the internet from different places on the internet, how much traffic in our simulation corresponded to how many annual US dollars in revenue. Okay. And so we looked at, this is again, I think, a sorted 50 deployment. If you just do avoiding decoy routers, how much money are each of the decoy routers losing from that strategy? And it's like, what's that, like maybe $5 million a year median. And if you do reverse poisoning, so if you do the getting traffic not to go back to you, it's more, maybe $20 million. And if you look at how much are each of those sorted 50 decoy routers losing in potential opportunity costs, how much are they losing out by not defecting from their deployment? They're looking at like $50 million, the median, by not sending traffic, by participating in this system that makes China unhappy. So that means that there are these kind of real economic barriers to getting purely economically motivated ISPs to deploy these decoy routers. All right. It took me a lot longer to explain than I thought it would, so I won't talk about the other stuff I was going to talk about. Thanks.
Very brief questions for Nick?
Tar.
So previous slide, you talked, not previous slide, 2 slides before that.
Okay. 1 slide, 2 slides.
Yeah. So defection, here you're like, what if one of them decides not to? Because so you start off with this game where everyone's cooperating with the telex or what have you, and then one of them is going to decide not to play anymore. But that's like saying, okay, the game stops there. But it goes on. It'd be like, okay, well, what happens if now everyone else starts to defect?
Yep.
So your benefit decreases as you get more and more routes that are now defecting, right? And it kind of takes out the another player, which is people who actually fund decoy routers in the first place to be in those places, because this is not just like.
So, right. So the question is, okay, so there is this other player who wants to deploy the decoy routers in the first place, right? And so one way of looking at these defection costs is saying, okay, suppose you want to get this sorted 50 deployment, right? How much is it going to cost you? How much are you going to have to pay everyone so that they won't defect?
Right. So basically, you're trying to aim at the steady state. You're like, to reach a equilibrium, how much money would we have to pump into this thing so that we end up with 50 stable routers doing this, right? Yep. Yeah. So do you have any ideas? Like how much?
Well, that's what this number is.
Oh, so it would be like 50 million a year?
Per the median, yes.
So say like these are supposed to be tier 1 ISPs and stuff like that. And in order to convince them, you probably need a pretty big player to be playing this game, like the government perhaps.
Yes,
maybe
like a.
The US. Maybe.
Sure.
I think they have that much money.
No, they borrowed from China.
Oh, well, that's perfect. Yeah, we're using that money to. So yeah, I was just wondering about if you thought, more.
Yeah, that's the median. So that's the median. The numbers on the next slide are the median payment that they would have to make to the 50 ISPs. Right. So it's per year to stay in the game.
Right.
Okay, I think we're out of time, so let's just.
All right.